You know the story. Factories, progress, innovation. The Industrial Revolution transformed humanity from backward farmers into modern civilization. Engines roared to life, railways connected continents, and suddenly everything got faster, cheaper, better. Except here's the part they skip in textbooks. All that glittering progress required sacrificing something. Actually, scratch that. Sacrificing everything, because while the history books celebrate steam engines and economic booms, they conveniently forget to mention the literal children dying inside those machines. The rivers turned into toxic sludge, the workers coughing up blood in disease-ridden slums, the entire continents stripped bare to fuel British factories. 'Cause the Industrial Revolution wasn't just an era of innovation, it was humanity's first experiment in large-scale systematic destruction of people and planet for profit. And spoiler alert, we're still running that same experiment today. So let's talk about what really happened between 1760 and 1840 when Britain decided economic growth mattered more than human lives. The spinning jenny, the steam engine, the power loom. From 1760 onward, Britain exploded with inventions that changed everything. James Watt perfected the steam engine in 1776, making it possible to power factories anywhere without relying on water wheels. Suddenly you could build massive mills in city centers and pump out textiles faster than anyone thought possible. And pump them out they did. By the 1820s, Britain was producing more textiles than the rest of the world combined. Between 1760 and 1830, British industrial output increased by over 300%. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham exploded from small towns into massive industrial centers practically overnight. The money was absolutely insane. The top 1% of British society controlled over 60% of the nation's wealth by 1830. Factory owners like Richard Arkwright died worth millions, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. The Greggs of Manchester owned multiple textile mills and lived in country estates with dozens of rooms. Meanwhile, the people actually making everything? They got packed into slums and worked until they literally dropped dead. 'Cause here's what the history books skip. That economic miracle required treating human beings like disposable machine parts. The promise was simple. Come work in the mills, earn wages, join modern prosperity. The reality was a brutal system designed to extract maximum profit from human labor while paying workers just barely enough to survive. Not thrive, survive. Factory owners marketed this as progress and opportunity. Anyone could make it with hard work and determination. Classic propaganda. But on the ground, Britain had invented a new form of exploitation that was efficient, scalable, and devastatingly effective at turning human suffering into shareholder value. The pattern was elegant in its cruelty. Take desperate people who'd lost their farms to enclosure laws, dangle steady wages, pack them into factories, work them until they broke, then replace them with fresh bodies. An assembly line for human destruction, powered by steam and justified by economics. And it happened so fast that nobody with power stopped to ask if maybe, just maybe, this was a terrible idea. One decade, you're a nation of farmers and craftsmen. The next, you're an industrial superpower with smoke-choked skies and rivers running black with poison. Progress, baby. So how did Britain build this empire of industry that textbooks still celebrate? By starting with the most vulnerable people in society and working them to death. Kids. How young? Try 6 years old. By the 1830s, children made up nearly 50% of the workforce in textile mills. Some started at 5 or 6 years old. Great career opportunities for kindergarteners. And these weren't cute apprenticeships where kids learned a trade. These were brutal, dangerous jobs that no adult wanted to do. Factory owners specifically hired children because their small hands could reach into machinery. They were easy to control, and most importantly, they worked for a fraction of adult wages. Economics. So, what kind of jobs did 6-year-olds do? In textile mills, children worked as scavengers, crawling under operating machinery to collect loose cotton while the equipment was still running. One wrong move and they'd lose fingers, hands, or get crushed entirely. In coal mines, children as young as 5 worked as trappers, sitting alone in pitch-black tunnels for 12 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors. Chimney sweeps? Factory owners literally sent children up narrow chimneys to scrape out soot, where they'd suffocate, get stuck, or develop cancer from toxic exposure. The hours were insane. Most children worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 6 days a week. That's 72 to 96 hours per week for a 6-year-old, starting at 5 a.m., ending at 9 p.m., with maybe 30 minutes for lunch if they were lucky. Fell asleep on the job? Beatings? Worked too slowly? More beatings? Tried to run away? Beatings plus wage deductions. Factory supervisors carried leather straps specifically for hitting children who couldn't keep pace with the machines. The injury rates were horrific. Records from Manchester mills in the 1830s show children suffered crushed limbs, severed fingers, scalping injuries from getting hair caught in machinery, and permanent spinal deformities from bending over equipment all day. Many developed respiratory diseases from breathing cotton dust and never made it past their teenage years. But here's the truly evil part. Many of these children weren't even there by choice. Orphanages and workhouses literally sold children to factory owners as apprentices. These kids were essentially slaves, bound by contracts they couldn't read, working until they either aged out, got injured too badly to continue, or died, which happened a lot. Factory owners defended this with arguments that sound absolutely insane today. Children were naturally suited for factory work. It built character. Parents needed the extra income. All of which translates to, we can exploit children for massive profit and nobody's stopping us. And nobody was. Zero labor laws, zero safety regulations, zero protections. The government's position was basically, the market will sort itself out. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But it wasn't just the kids getting destroyed. Adults had their own special hell waiting on the factory floor. Picture a textile factory in Manchester, 1835. Step inside and the noise hits you first, deafening, constant mechanical roaring that makes conversation impossible. The air is thick with cotton dust that coats your lungs with every breath. Temperature deliberately kept above 80 degrees because hot, humid air keeps cotton threads from breaking. And packed into this hellscape are hundreds of workers standing at massive spinning machines for 14 to 16 hours straight. Welcome to adult factory life, slightly less likely to die than the children, but not by much. Most workers put in 14 to 16-hour shifts, 6 days a week. That's 84 to 96 hours per week of standing in one spot, performing the same repetitive motions, breathing toxic air, surrounded by machinery that could kill you instantly if you made one wrong move. And this was like if OSHA didn't exist, because it didn't. The injuries were constant, crushed limbs from getting caught in spinning equipment, severed fingers from trying to clear jams while machines were running, scalping injuries when long hair got caught in gears, hearing loss from the noise, respiratory diseases from breathing cotton dust, coal particles, or chemical fumes. And these weren't accidents. They were predictable consequences of a system designed to prioritize production speed over human safety. Factory owners knew the risks. They just didn't care. 'cause installing safety equipment cost money, and dead workers were cheaper to replace than machines were to modify. Got injured on the job? Too bad. No workers' compensation, no disability benefits, no medical leave. You were immediately fired and replaced, often within hours. Factory supervisors kept lists of desperate people waiting outside the gates, so if you couldn't work, you couldn't eat. The wages were barely enough to survive on. Textile workers in the 1830s earned about 10 to 15 shillings per week. A single room in a slum tenement cost 2 to 3 shillings per week. Food for a family cost another 8 to 10 shillings. So even with both parents working full-time, families were living paycheck to paycheck with zero margin for error. Meanwhile, factory owners were getting obscenely rich. Richard Arkwright died in 1792, worth over $500,000, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. The Greggs of Manchester owned multiple mills and lived in massive estates while their workers lived in slums literally within sight of the factory. The life expectancy differences were stark. Factory workers in industrial cities typically died in their late 30s or early 40s. The wealthy factory owners? Living into their 60s and 70s. Same city, same era, completely different lifespans based entirely on which side of the factory floor you stood on. But the owners had their justifications ready. Factory work was voluntary. Workers could leave any time. Technically true. Except leaving meant starvation. They claimed high wages justified the conditions. But the wages weren't high. They were subsistence level. They insisted that without factories, workers would have no jobs at all, which ignores that enclosure laws had deliberately destroyed rural livelihoods to create a desperate labor force. Exploitation dressed up as economic opportunity, and everyone knew it. And if you somehow survived the factory floor, congratulations, you got to go home to a disease-ridden slum that might kill you anyway. So where did workers live? In slums so overcrowded and disease-ridden they make modern developing world housing look luxurious. In Manchester during the 1830s and 1840s, entire families crammed into single rooms measuring maybe 10 by 12 feet. Not apartments, rooms. One room for cooking, sleeping, eating, and everything else. Buildings packed these rooms together with zero ventilation, no windows in many cases, and walls so thin you could hear everything 3 families over. The density was insane. In some Manchester neighborhoods, housing density reached over 400 people per acre. Modern urban planners consider anything over 100 people per acre extremely dense. So these industrial slums were literally 4 times more crowded than what we'd consider acceptable today. And there was no sanitation infrastructure. Zero. Most buildings had one shared outdoor toilet for dozens of families, if they had a toilet at all. Many areas relied on open cesspits where human waste just accumulated in the streets and courtyards. The 1842 Sanitary Condition Report describes neighborhoods where sewage ran in open channels between houses and waste piled up in cellars where people lived. The water supply was completely contaminated. Workers drew water from rivers and wells downstream from industrial waste discharge and sewage runoff. The River Irwell in Manchester ran black with dye chemicals and thick with industrial sludge. People drank from it anyway because there was no alternative. Disease epidemics were constant. Cholera hit British industrial cities repeatedly throughout the 1830s and 1840s. The 1832 cholera epidemic killed over 23,000 people in Britain, with industrial cities hit hardest. Typhoid fever was endemic. Tuberculosis ravaged the working class. Typhus spread through overcrowded housing. Smallpox periodically swept through slum neighborhoods. Infant mortality rates were horrific. In Manchester and Liverpool during the 1840s, nearly 50% of children died before age 5, 1 in 2. In wealthy neighborhoods in the same cities, closer to 20%. Life expectancy by class was stark and brutal. In Liverpool in 1840, the average age at death for laborers and their families was 15 years. 15. For tradespeople, 22 years. For the gentry and professional classes, 35 years. And this wasn't some natural disaster. This was a direct, predictable consequence of cramming hundreds of thousands of workers into cities with zero planning, zero infrastructure, and zero concern for public health. Factory owners and city planners knew what was happening. They just didn't care enough to do anything about it. Social breakdown was inevitable. Alcoholism rates skyrocketed as workers sought escape from grinding misery. Gin was cheap and provided a few hours of numbness. Prostitution became a survival strategy for women and girls who couldn't find factory work or whose wages weren't enough to live on. Crime rates soared as desperate people did desperate things to feed their families. Imagine working 16 hours in a dangerous factory, coming home to a disease-ridden slum where half your children died before age 5, with no hope of improvement, no safety net, and no way out. That was daily life for millions of workers throughout the Industrial Revolution. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, factory owners were living in massive country estates with manicured gardens, clean water, fresh air, and life expectancies double those of their workers. The contrast was visible, obvious, and intentional. And this is before we even talk about what the Industrial Revolution was doing to the planet. Picture the English countryside before industrialization, rolling green hills, clear streams, forests teeming with wildlife. Now picture it 50 years later, skies blackened with coal smoke, rivers running toxic colors, forests cleared for fuel, entire landscapes transformed into industrial wastelands. The Industrial Revolution didn't just exploit people, it launched humanity's first full-scale assault on the planet itself. The air pollution was apocalyptic. Coal-burning factories pumped out massive amounts of smoke, soot, and sulfur dioxide that turned the sky perpetually gray. In Manchester during the 1840s, the sun was often invisible through the smog. The famous London pea soup fog? That wasn't natural fog. That was industrial pollution so thick you literally couldn't see across the street. By the 1850s, Britain was burning over 50 million tons of coal per year. That coal released sulfur dioxide, creating acid rain that ate away at buildings, killed vegetation, and poisoned soil. The first documented cases of acid rain damaging ecosystems date to this period. Turns out, pumping unlimited pollution into the atmosphere has consequences. Water pollution was equally catastrophic. Rivers became open sewers for industrial waste. Textile factories dumped dye chemicals directly into waterways, turning rivers bright unnatural colors, red, green, blue, depending on what they were producing that day. The River Thames in London became so polluted that fish populations collapsed entirely by the 1850s. The Great Stink of 1858 made the river smell so bad that Parliament had to soak curtains in chloride of lime just to function. Chemical plants discharged mercury, lead, arsenic, and other toxins straight into rivers. Tanneries dumped animal waste and harsh chemicals. Iron foundries released heavy metals, and all of this flowed downstream to where people drew their drinking water. Deforestation accelerated at unprecedented pace. Britain's forests were stripped to fuel industrial expansion. Trees became charcoal for iron smelting, timber for construction, fuel for steam engines. Entire woodland ecosystems disappeared within decades. When Britain ran out of its own forests, it started importing timber from colonies, exporting the environmental destruction globally. Wildlife populations collapsed. Industrial expansion destroyed habitats on a massive scale. Species that had lived in Britain for millennia went extinct or were pushed to the brink. The combination of habitat loss, pollution, and hunting for industrial materials devastated biodiversity. Soil depletion became serious as industrial agriculture expanded to feed growing urban populations. Traditional farming gave way to intensive cultivation that exhausted the land. Combined with deforestation and erosion, Britain's agricultural capacity actually began declining even as industrial output soared. And here's the kicker. This was the beginning of climate change. The Industrial Revolution marked humanity's transition to fossil fuel dependence, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at scales never seen before. Scientists wouldn't understand the greenhouse effect until decades later, but the damage was already being done. The birth of dead zones around industrial centers showed just how extreme the damage was. Areas within miles of major factories became essentially uninhabitable. Vegetation died, water sources became toxic, air quality made breathing difficult. But Britain couldn't fuel this industrial nightmare with local resources alone, so they exported the horror globally through colonialism. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Industrial Revolution was only possible because of colonialism and slavery. Britain's factories needed massive amounts of raw materials. Those materials came from brutal extraction systems across the empire. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect. It was the entire business model. Cotton was the foundation of Britain's textile boom. That cotton came from American slave plantations. By the 1850s, over 80% of Britain's cotton imports came from the American South, where enslaved people were forced to pick the crop under brutal conditions. British factory owners knew exactly where their cotton came from. They just didn't care because cheap cotton meant massive profits. The numbers tell the story. Between 1780 and 1860, British cotton imports increased from £5 million to over £1 billion annually. That explosion in demand directly fueled the expansion of slavery in America. More British factories meant more slave plantations. Progress. But it wasn't just America. Britain systematically deindustrialized India to eliminate competition. In the early 1700s, India produced about 25% of the world's industrial output, with a thriving textile industry. By 1900, that number had collapsed to under 2%. What happened? British colonial policies deliberately destroyed Indian manufacturing through tariffs, forced agricultural production, and outright violence. The Bengal textile industry, which had produced high-quality cloth for centuries, was systematically dismantled. British administrators imposed massive taxes on Indian-made goods while flooding the market with cheap British textiles. Indian weavers went from skilled artisans to destitute laborers within a generation. The famines that resulted were genocidal in scale. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed approximately 10 million people, roughly one-third of Bengal's population. The Great Famine of 1876-1878 killed between 5 and 10 million across India. These weren't natural disasters. They were direct consequences of British policies that prioritized export crops and profit extraction over feeding the population. Meanwhile, Africa was being carved up for resource extraction. In the Congo Free State under Belgian King Leopold II, an estimated 10 million Congolese people died from forced labor, violence, and disease between 1885 and 1908. They were worked to death extracting rubber for European industries. Britain forced China into the opium trade through military violence. When China tried to ban opium imports because the drug was devastating their population, Britain launched the Opium Wars in 1839 and 1856. Let that sink in. Britain went to war to force another country to accept drug imports, all to balance trade deficits and fund industrial expansion. The wealth extraction was staggering. Historians estimate that Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India alone between 1765 and 1938. That's not a typo. Trillion. The resources, labor, and wealth stolen from colonies directly funded Britain's Industrial Revolution. Indigenous populations across the British Empire were displaced, enslaved, or killed to access resources. In Australia, Aboriginal populations were systematically massacred to clear land. In South Africa, British mining companies used forced labor systems that were slavery in all but name. In the Caribbean, sugar plantations worked enslaved people to death to feed British factories and workers. The pattern was consistent. Identify valuable resources, use violence to take control, extract everything possible while paying nothing, ship it back to Britain, let the local population deal with the consequences. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate imperial policy designed to fuel industrial growth. And the global wealth inequality we see today? Directly rooted in this period. Countries that were colonized during the Industrial Revolution remain systematically poorer. Countries that did the colonizing remain systematically wealthier. The economic advantages built on colonial extraction compound over time. Eventually, people started fighting back, because even in the darkest timeline, humans refused to stay broken. Workers didn't just accept these conditions. From the earliest days of industrialization, people organized, protested, and fought back. And the resistance was dangerous because unions were literally illegal in Britain until 1824. The Luddites were among the first major resistance movements, active from 1811 to 1816. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't anti-technology idiots. They were skilled textile workers whose livelihoods were being destroyed by factory owners using machines to replace them with cheaper, unskilled labor. So they destroyed the machinery, targeting specific factories owned by the worst exploiters. The government's response? Made machine-breaking a capital offense and deployed thousands of troops to hunt down Luddites. More soldiers than Britain had sent to fight Napoleon in Portugal. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 showed exactly how governments treated worker protests. Around 60,000 people gathered peacefully in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform and better working conditions. The government sent in cavalry who charged the crowd with sabers, killing at least 15 people and injuring over 600. The message was clear. Demand better treatment and we'll kill you. But workers kept organizing. Trade unions formed despite being illegal, meeting in secret and risking arrest. The Tolpuddle Martyrs in 1834 were 6 agricultural laborers sentenced to transportation to Australia just for forming a union. Their crime? Swearing an oath of solidarity. That's it. The Chartist movement in the 1830s and 1840s was massive, with millions of workers signing petitions demanding political reforms. The government rejected their petitions repeatedly and arrested Chartist leaders. But the movement kept pressure on the system. Gradually, the pressure started working. The Factory Act of 1833 was Britain's first meaningful attempt at labor regulation, limiting children under 9 from working in textile mills and restricting children aged 9 to 13 to 8-hour days. Revolutionary, right? Only took 8 decades to decide that maybe 6-year-olds working 16-hour shifts was bad, but enforcement was weak, and many factory owners just ignored the law. The 1847 Factory Act limited the workday to 10 hours for women and children. Adult men still had no protections. Social reformers like Lord Shaftesbury pushed for stronger protections, documenting horrific conditions and pressuring Parliament. Robert Owen, a factory owner himself, proved that treating workers decently could still be profitable. But most owners dismissed him as naive. Public health reforms came mostly because disease outbreaks started threatening the wealthy. After cholera epidemics hit rich neighborhoods, suddenly the government cared about sanitation. The Public Health Act of 1848 established basic standards, though implementation was slow and often ignored in working-class areas. Worker education movements and cooperative societies formed as alternative power structures. Workers pooled resources, created mutual aid societies, and built institutions outside the control of factory owners. But here's the reality. These reforms were partial victories at best. Child labor continued well into the 20th century. Factory conditions remained dangerous for decades. Environmental destruction accelerated. The fundamental exploitative model didn't change. It just adapted and moved elsewhere. Sound familiar? Because the Industrial Revolution's playbook didn't disappear. It just moved to different countries and got rebranded as globalization. Garment factories in Bangladesh employ workers in conditions that would be instantly recognizable to a 19th-century Manchester textile worker. Low wages, dangerous conditions, long hours, zero job security. The 2013 Rana Plaza collapse killed over 100 garment workers in a building that factory owners knew was unsafe. Same pattern, different continent. Fast fashion brands source from these factories because labor is cheap and regulations are minimal. Your $10 shirt exists because someone worked in conditions remarkably similar to Industrial Revolution Britain. We didn't solve the exploitation problem. We just exported it. Tech manufacturing follows identical patterns. Foxconn factories in China installed suicide nets around their buildings because worker conditions were so bad that people were jumping to their deaths. Workers doing repetitive tasks for 12-hour shifts, living in crowded dormitories, earning barely enough to survive. It's the digital age version of 19th-century factory dormitories. Child labor still exists at shocking scales. An estimated 160 million children worldwide are engaged in child labor. Cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo use child labor to extract materials for our smartphones and electric car batteries. Garment factories across South Asia employ children for pennies per day. The chocolate industry relies heavily on child labor in West Africa. We know this is happening. Companies know. Governments know. But the system continues because cheap labor in poor countries keeps prices low and profits high. The gig economy brought Industrial Revolution-style exploitation back to developed nations. Amazon warehouse workers tracked by algorithms, penalized for bathroom breaks, injured at rates higher than comparable industries. Uber and delivery drivers classified as independent contractors to avoid providing benefits, earning below minimum wage after expenses. It's piecework wages and zero job security dressed up with apps and called innovation. Environmental destruction has only accelerated. The Industrial Revolution started burning fossil fuels at scale. We never stopped. Climate change, ocean acidification, mass extinction, ecosystem collapse, the logical continuation of treating the planet as an infinite resource to be exploited. The wealth inequality patterns established during the Industrial Revolution have only intensified. In 2024, the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 95% of humanity combined. Countries that industrialized early remain systematically wealthier than countries that were colonized. The gap isn't closing, it's widening. Corporate rhetoric still sounds like 19th-century factory owners. Disruption and innovation justify worker exploitation. Efficiency means squeezing more productivity from humans while paying them less. Free market means letting companies externalize costs onto workers, communities, and the environment. The lesson of the Industrial Revolution should have been: unchecked capitalism prioritizes profit over human welfare and environmental sustainability, leading to massive suffering and destruction. Instead, the lesson taken was, this system is incredibly profitable for those at the top, so let's keep doing it. We have more technology, more wealth, and more knowledge than at any point in human history. And we're still using the same exploitative model invented in 18th century Britain: child labor, dangerous working conditions, environmental destruction, wealth extraction from poor regions to enrich wealthy ones. It's all still here. So, what are we going to do differently? Because right now, we're running the same experiment and expecting different results.